Welcome to Super Dave's RC. I realized I should probably make a little bit of a somewhat in-depth video on this little beast here before we get too far into the modifications. The trickiest part of this thing was getting all four carburetors synchronized but yet tunable, because they're not going to run identically, so you need to be able to somewhat adjust each throttle position independently. So basically we have the throttle servo. It runs that lever there, which then pulls that lever, which rotates that rod. And then you can see we're running slip links at each of these points. That way I can slightly adjust the distance to the rear carburetor to make sure everything opens and closes at the same point. That way when I hit full throttle on the front carb, I should be sitting at full throttle in the rear, and the same way with idle. If I can get the boot off of here. So yeah, we're just right at idle. You can't really see it in the camera. And then full throttle. Oh, I'm a little out of spec. Oh, that's the other thing too. I need to add a chassis brace because we basically have one large unsupported platform with the cage off. This metal cage acts as the rest of the structure, but really that's not sufficient. I need to add something in here rigid. But we will figure that out next with round 2 of the improvements. Anyway, back to the tour here. Again, this thing being huge, got a lot of weight to deal with, so we've actually got 4 metal disc brakes down in here. You can see the 4 little discs in here, so it's actually got a huge amount of braking force. And then also we're running some very rare weld racing wheels. And yeah, we've got a Kyosho, well, I forget actually what this front end, yeah, it is a Kyosho front end. And I have no idea what the rear is. But anyway, we've got 2 roto start units and 2 pull starts. Again, just basically the way everything laid out, we didn't have room to do really 4 rotos because there's no way to really get to that one other one. But this one's got the starter point here, and then it's on the outboard side over here on this one. So you use roto starts to get the first 2 going, and then once you get them 2 going, you can get to the cranks back here. And this one just has a little elevated point up here to get it handy so you can get to it without burning your fingers. That was a relatively self-evolving mod. Anyway, also to help move things along, I've got a little pump here that helps force the fuel along so I don't have to deal with priming issues. Again, there's enough going on here, so might as well make one thing easier. And then the back carburetors have built-in plunger primers, so again we don't have to deal with that initial. And then once this engine is going, we're going to have pressure to the tank, so then we don't need to worry about pressurizing this one. It's going to be up to pressure instantly, which is why we have a fuel cutoff over here. So when we're starting this one over here, the number 1, we're going to clamp off number 2. Then when it's going and running fine and we're ready to start number 2, then we're going to go ahead and let the fuel open and get that thing started up quick like. And as I mentioned there the other day, we're running dual shocks back here. Again, it's got a fair amount of weight to it with all this stuff. And of course we've got sway bars front and rear. Oh yeah, it is a keel showing back there. Alright. Anyway, like I said, we're running 2 center diffs that are basically locked. And before you go grabbing the JB weld to lock your diff, don't. Just get some random nuts or washers or screws or something and pack it in there. It will bind it up so it can't rotate. That's all you need to have happen. You just want it to not turn. So put a bunch of junk in there so it can't rotate, and then you're set. And then if you ever want to unlock it, all you got to do is clean out whatever junk you put in there. Don't put JB weld in there. It's just going to ruin it. Because you'll find out very quick after you lock your diff the reason nobody does that from the factory, because it eats tires and they drive like crap. Anyway, back to our hero here. The biggest, trickiest part of this thing was getting the engines placed, because they had these fixed mount where the screws basically go right into the base of the engine. But got it in there pretty nicely with the gear lash where we want it. And we've got our steering servo up here with a nice direct throw on our center link there. So the steering is quite nice and responsive, although I think my servo is dying. It was acting weird a minute ago. Anyway, so then our cage mounts on these points back here, and these screw holes up here. So that effectively creates the upper part of the chassis brace. Because again, it's basically one large unsupported platform, and that little bit of sag will change the dimension between this point and this point, throwing off my idle. So it's very critical that I have this platform rigid. Like I said, with the chassis on, it's fine, but I might try to add something. Obviously, we got a lot going on here, and I got to be careful not to get above these because I need to be able to get the glow heaters to them. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. Stay tuned. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a good one.